So far as I know, the first refugee crisis novel, the least important one, has just come out. It's called Exit West, and it's written by Mohsin Hamid, who's a great Pakistani novelist. You can now buy it, as I just did this afternoon, a few hours ago, at Shakespeare and Company, 18 euros in paperback. And so far as I can tell, since this is so far still secondhand, I've read about it, it's a kind of nightmarish fairy tale. Nightmarish because the protagonists, who are named Saeed and Nadia, and who live in some unidentified place, which it could be Damascus or some other terrifying place, undergo terrible travails and witness vast amounts of terror and killing. A fairy tale because in the end they magically pop out in the West. And even more a fairy tale because they are welcomed in the end. According to the review that I read in the New York Times, the reviewer said, after the natives get over their initial fear of strangers, both the natives and the strangers discover they are just as likely to get along as not. So, like all fairy tales, the novel obviously speaks to our deepest yearnings, which are both that these victims, these innocent people, receive the welcome that they wish, but also in a way for ourselves, that they join us in this world where natives and strangers mingle, and where our own lives are enriched and our own personal borders are extended by the chance to live among people who are like us as well as people who are not like us. In some way, the refugee crisis presents itself not only as a terrible tragedy for the people who are themselves the refugees, but as a certain almost kind of opportunity for those people who seek to have who believe in and seek to have a cosmopolitan world. And if any of you have read the book by Anthony Appiah, the philosopher Anthony Appiah, which is called Cosmopolitanism, he, in a way, speaks about this world where everyone is a citizen of the world, which it is my impression is the vision that Mohsin Hamid holds out for us at the end of this book. It is also what John Stuart Mill talks about, the father of our idea of liberalism, when he celebrates the idea of diversity of modes of life. So it is the world that we seek and we would wish to welcome these refugees into. But of course, it's a fairy tale. And we talk about the refugee crisis because it is a terrible crisis, and in two different ways. Both as a tragedy and a calamity, of course, for the refugees themselves, but also as a political calamity in Europe, as an event that has wrenched the politics of Europe in a way that is very, very frightening. And that is very much going to be my subject tonight. So I don't think that the refugee crisis is a political crisis because so many people have failed to show the active sympathy and show the cosmopolitan spirit that people in Exit West show to Saeed and Nadia, or because people have failed the test of cosmopolitanism. First, we have to remember that the way refugees arrived has had a huge effect on the way it has shaped the politics of Europe. That people didn't come by twos and tens and hundreds the way perhaps they do in this novel. They came in a way that was unprecedented, in a way that seemed to be a never-ending wave. They came trampling borders that had been made free in order to have students and businessmen and vacationers move back and forth. So it created a sense of fear among a great many people because of the immensity and suddenness, a fear that ultimately is soured into anger. But it's also very signally because the refugees are not Saeed and Nadia. Now, again, I haven't read this yet, so I'm just telling you what I've now learned from reading the review. Saeed and Nadia are cosmopolitan urbanites who meet in an evening class on corporate identity and product branding in whatever Damascus-like town they're in. I don't know what the refugee crisis would have been like if the people who wound up coming were Saeed and Nadia. But the truth is, of course, that most of the refugees who have come to Europe from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, are not urban cosmopolites. So let me talk a little bit about my sense of this just from the experience I've had as a journalist. So as Grant said, I've spent a fair amount of the last year in countries all across Europe, in Sweden, in Poland, in Hungary, in France, Germany, writing about the refugee crisis, talking to refugees and talking to the people who live there. And over the last couple of months, I've been twice to Dresden, where I plan to return several times to write about this. So let me talk a little bit about that. I chose Dresden for a reason. First, because if you're going to try to understand the refugee crisis, both the question of refugee integration and the question of politics of the refugee crisis, you have to go to Germany. Germany obviously took the lion's share of refugees. I chose to go to Dresden because I didn't want to go to one of the wealthy cities of the West, to Munich or Frankfurt, which are, in a way, too extraordinary. I mean, because those places are profoundly progressive, and because they have infinite funds compared to almost anybody else, the problems that exist all over Europe are buffered there. So I have spent time in Munich, but I thought, no, I should go to the east. And so I went to Dresden, which is still Germany. It's still a very wealthy city. And so the kinds of things that are provided for the refugees are still ample. Those who have been granted asylum, mostly Syrians, but Iraqis and others as well, have an okay apartment. They have a stipend which is sufficient for their needs. They have language training. They have job training. So whatever is being done that will make it possible to integrate the refugees within reasonable expectations is being done. And so I spend a lot of time with refugees. And there are people like Saeed and Nadia. I met a lesbian couple, pardon me, I met a gay couple from Lebanon who fled for their lives when it was discovered that they were gay. One was a restaurateur. They were very sophisticated. I met a woman who's a dancer. I met people who will clearly integrate well into the Europe they have come to. But most people I met are not like that. One wishes that were the case, but it's just not the case. A much more typical example would be a family I met from Aleppo. Jamal and Mirvet and their 3 kids. He had a metalworking shop in Aleppo. In 2012, Aleppo was devastated. I see my friend Janita Giovanni is here, and she has reported about this with incredible richness and detail and emotional depth. Aleppo became an early front line, and they fled with their 3 kids. They fled all across Syria, back and forth to different allegedly safe cities. They went to Turkey. They spent time in Turkey, and they finally made their way to Europe, profoundly exhausted, demoralized. And so Jamal said to me, my life is finished, I'm very happy I'm here, I'm very grateful to the Germans, but I can't work. He's taking German, but he admits it's very hard for him. Mirvet, so far as I could tell, had never worked because she was a traditional Syrian woman. Of the 3 kids, the 2 boys had dropped out of school in 7th grade or so. Not because of the war, but because their father ran had a workshop and they had to work for him. And Muhammad, who was 20, was hoping to be a baker. He loved to make sweets, and he had apprenticed himself to a baker, but he recognized that in Germany it's very, very hard to advance in any kind of internship or program if you don't have a high school education. He has a 7th grade education. It wasn't clear to him, not clear to me, what will happen. The only one in the family who I felt hopeful about was her name was Firtan, who was a 5th grader who didn't remember anything about Syria. She was starting her life anew. She had learned German. She had all the problems that a 5th grade girl has, but not otherwise. And so when I thought about this family, I thought these are profoundly deserving people. They are every bit as deserving as Said and Nadia. And I was proud of Germany that they had accepted these people. I'm ashamed of the United States that they haven't. But the issue isn't moral desert. The issue is the difficulty, the enormous effort, the struggle that will be involved with integrating people. And that is going to be, there's no question that's going to be extremely hard. And it will take a long time before we can see whether or not that's worked. Now, that is the part of the refugee crisis which involves, in a way, the refugees themselves. Then there is the crisis which is the political crisis, the political backlash against that. Now, that political backlash in Germany and elsewhere would have happened even if everybody was Said and Nadia, because there are racists and skinheads and xenophobes who are going to hate anybody who comes. And in fact, Dresden happens to be the home, and it's not coincidental that I chose it that way, of Pegida. Pegida, some of you may know that name. Pegida is a thuggish movement of people who are enraged about refugees. It began in Dresden, it spread elsewhere in Germany. There are now branches of it everywhere in Northern Europe. Once a week in Dresden, they have their so-called evening stroll to let you know that they're there. Used to be all skinheads, now it's mostly older people who like going out for an evening stroll, but they're older people who have really bad views about refugees. But the fact is that is not the sole or even chief source of this political backlash. It's much broader than that, and the question of who the refugees are and the difficulties of integration is very much relevant to I think to the breadth of this reaction. So Dresden is also a place where the political party called Alternative for Germany, Alternative for Deutschland, is very, very powerful. Not just Dresden, but that whole area of Saxony. And while I was there, I spoke to Frauke Petry. Frauke Petry is the woman who's the head of, she's one of the co-heads of Alternative for Deutschland. And she was very explicit in saying Islam is incompatible with Christianity, and these Muslims are going to try to impose Sharia law, and that's their ideology. And again, Alternative for Deutschland right now is, I don't know what, maybe it has 10 or 12% in polls of the German people. That's troubling. But that's still not, in any way at all, the whole reaction against that. So what also struck me when I was there is that the government of Saxony is in the control of Angela Merkel's party, the CDU. But it's a more conservative wing of the CDU. While there, I had a delightful dinner with an amiable young guy who used to be a chef, whose name is Sebastian Fischer. He's 36 years old, and he's a member of Angela Merkel's party. And he said to me, Pegida's terrible, they're thugs, they're criminals, I hate them. But the AfD, he said, well, I think they're a little bit too extreme, I wish their language and tactics were different, but I basically share their views. And he said to me, I'm happy we've taken some refugees, but after all, they do have something against German culture. That was this fear about integration. They're not going to be part of our world. And interestingly, I said to him, don't you feel as a German that you have a special responsibility to take refugees? And this is what he said to me. He said, look at me. He said, I'm 34 years old. I have nothing to do with any history before 1991. And then he went on to say, he said, it's true that Merkel thinks that way, and a lot of German intellectuals think that way. He said, these are opinions that are confined to the past, and they will not survive in the future. The foundations of Germany have changed. Now, I don't know Germany at all well enough to know if that's a correct statement or not, but it's a very, very troubling statement when we think about the political consequences of the refugee crisis. And by the way, it's worth noting that these conversations happened before the Christmas bombing, the bombing of the Christmas market in Berlin. So maybe things would be different when I went back. But my conversations there were not mostly about terrorism. And I've been struck by that in a number of places. I spent a long time in Sweden in November of 2015. And I found a lot of people there who were very, very, let's just say, troubled by refugees. Nobody mentioned terrorism. My general impression is that the biggest driver of the political backlash is not terrorism, but this question of integration. Now, obviously, any act of violent extremism is the most intense possible statement of repudiation of your host country. Nevertheless, my sense is that it would be enough to drive this right-wing political backlash if it is seen that Syrian and Afghan fathers keep their daughters at home in violation of European values, if young refugee men harass young European women, if Salafi imams open mosques, that is to say, these cultural questions, those in themselves will continue to drive this right-wing backlash, even in the absence, I think, of terrorism. So, in a way, I can say that my worry is that Jamal and Mirvet will not turn the same appealing face, and cannot, to Europe that Saeed and Nadia do. So, in this regard, the political crisis over the refugees joins something else. So, the refugee crisis, understood as itself, is this immense, unprecedented, epic tragedy. But if we think about the political consequences of it, this reaction, this fear of lack of integration, this sense of being under assault by others, then it's clear that one of the reasons for the intensity of the reaction is that the refugee crisis doesn't stand alone. In fact, it's the most intense possible example of a phenomenon that Europe has already been dealing with. The Front National wants to take back France, not from refugees. The refugees have been a really neuralgic issue here, but from immigrants who have been here for decades, from North African immigrants. Brexit was a reaction against strangers in our midst, and they weren't even refugees or non-white people. They were Polish waitresses in some town where people said, I've had it with these non-English people speaking non-English languages. Both in Poland and in Hungary, you have the rise of xenophobic parties in the absence of refugees. Poland has no refugees. Of course, Hungary had built fences against the refugees who wanted to come, but the Hungarian nationalist xenophobic party was elected in 2010, years before this happened. So we're talking about a pre-existing and larger phenomenon. Now, as Grant said, I just came back from Holland, and this was the really striking thing that I saw there. The Dutch are obsessed with what they claim to be threats to their national identity. The Dutch have had no terrorist incidents to speak of at all. They have taken refugees. They've taken 45,000 refugees. But I met quite a few hardcore nationalists who said, I'm happy we've taken refugees. That's not a problem. That's our moral responsibility. That's not their concern. The threat that they were concerned with came from immigrants who had been in Holland for generations, for 2 generations. as is the case in France. Now, even in France, you can say, well, France has suffered unspeakable terrorist incidents, and the French banlieue present to people who are fearful about this an image of alienation and bitterment, which frightens them. That's not true in Holland. It's not true. Immigrants don't burn cars in Holland. Nevertheless, there is this profound political reaction. And the reaction there is all about this issue of integration. It's the word you hear spoken again and again. The sense that these immigrants from Turkey and Morocco, as well as from places like Suriname and the Dutch Antilles, they're not becoming part of Dutch society. They've been here for 40 years, and they're still not becoming part of Dutch society. And it is a fact that the crime rate among non-European immigrants in Holland is about 4 times what it is among native Dutch. The unemployment rate is about 3 times what it is among native Dutch. The university going rate is far, far lower, even among second and third generation immigrants than among native Dutch. So there is this sense, this fear of an underclass. And I think specifically as regards Muslim immigrants, because remember we're talking about both dark-skinned people who are Christian, the Surinamese, the Antilles, and then people who are Muslim. And there's an interesting kind of blurring between the category immigrants and the category Islamic. But there's this special sense of fear, I think, about immigrants from the Islamic world, the sense of that there's a self-imposed isolation, that they are choosing not to be part of us. Now, this clearly doesn't apply to the overwhelming fraction of immigrants who will say to you, but I'm Dutch. Yes, I've come from Morocco or Turkey, but I'm Dutch. I came here when I was 10. I think of myself as Dutch. Nevertheless, this is the mentality. And there are just enough powerful symbolic incidents to continue fueling it. So one thing everybody mentioned to me when I was there is that in the days after the failed coup in Turkey last July, 5,000 Turkish immigrants, 5,000 Dutchmen who were originally from Turkey, took to the Erasmus Bridge in Rotterdam. The irony of the name didn't escape anybody. Erasmus, the father of the idea of humanism and political tolerance. And they were carrying placards with Erdogan's face on them, and they were shouting slogans, and a few of them assaulted journalists, and allegedly there were some Molotov cocktails thrown at apartments that were said to belong to Turks who were followers of Gulen, who Erdogan blamed for the coup. And this was shocking to people. This was seen as, they're not us. And there have been a number of things like this. There was also a very interesting book written by an Arabic-speaking former theology student who claimed to be a convert to Islam and in fact went underground in The Hague and reported on what he saw and talked about the rise of Salafist mosques, of people who utterly repudiated the Dutch way of life and Dutch values. And so this scares people. And again, this is Holland. This is a country, the first article of whose constitution prohibits discrimination. This is a country which practices tolerance as a daily virtue, but there's a widespread sense of resentment. Now, of course, this is what has led to the phenomenon of Geert Wilders. Geert Wilders is only going to get 1 out of 6 probably votes. But again, as with Germany, with Pegida and the AfD, the reaction is not limited to those who are on the more extreme side. The Prime Minister of Holland, Mark Rutte, who was a member of the center-right Liberal Party, famously took out a full-page ad in the Dutch papers, which, among other things, said to those Turkish marchers, he said, act normal or go away. Act normal or go away. And this is a respectable figure. He would be, in our French terms, kind of an Alain Juppé or maybe more like Fillon figure. And And you can imagine how shocking it is for a Dutch person of Moroccan background, a Turkish background, to be told, behave right or go away. But Rutte only said that because he knew that it would resonate with people. I mean, this was in the midst of a political campaign. So that's the world that we're in. And so then you have to ask, why? What is the reason for this upsurge of populist politics, not only in Holland, not only in France, in so many different places? So I want to talk about that a little bit. There's a very useful short book by John Judas, an American journalist, about populism. What is populism? And Judas says populism, the essence of populism, is the creation of a category of the people, which only includes some of the people, and characterizes the other people as the anti-people. In the populism of our moment, that other has become refugees, immigrants, but also the insiders, who are seen as, in some sense, allied with them. That is to say, the elite, this famous elite. So this combination of overclass and underclass, the resentment against these two allegedly allied parties, has become a very powerful, toxic thing. And so when Donald Trump, who I haven't managed to mention until just now, I told Grant I told Charlie I wouldn't say Donald Trump too often, when he describes the press as the enemy of the people, he is speaking the classic language of populism towards the elite, not towards these outsiders, the marginal classes. But I think so much, especially in Europe, the premise is, it is that elite which is sponsoring, which is championing those marginalized classes. I shouldn't say just Europe, because clearly when Trump talks about the immigration issue, that liberals want to bring in immigrants, that's very much the kind of language that you hear here. That it's the elite that is seeking to championing the cause of refugees, of immigrants, of giving rights and privileges to minority groups. So it's this peculiar fusion of classes. A useful way of thinking about this I encountered from Walter Russell Mead. Walter Russell Mead is this very well-known American historian who famously created a kind of set of taxonomy of American thinking, and he uses the word Jacksonian to refer to a certain kind of thinking. And he says today's populism in America, is what he's talking about the United States, is Jacksonian. What he means by that is that Jacksonians are kind of like what in England you call Little Englanders. That is to say, they believe that it is America and American culture that matters, and not larger, more universalistic ideas. For them, America is not the land of Enlightenment ideals that are established in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. No, it's the American people, it's us. And the elites are the people who, of course, they don't live in our world, they don't share our American values, they stand outside of our world, and their moral commitments are universalistic. They believe we have an obligation to refugees, they believe we have an obligation in foreign policy to help other countries, to intervene perhaps in the midst of atrocities, and all that makes them in some sense not us. And that thinking is very much akin to what I heard in Holland when people blamed liberal multiculturalists for coddling immigrants, or what I heard from Polish populists who complained about liberal Poles who were preoccupied with the noble values of the EU as opposed to the reality of Poland, or for that matter, what Sebastian Fischer says about German intellectuals who think the country has a special moral obligation to take all of these refugees. So, if the case, then the next question I ask is, why now? Why is this happening? Why this populist upsurge? Why this reaction against the other? So, clearly the refugee crisis itself is a big cause of that, but you can't think that this is all because of the refugee crisis. After all, the United States doesn't have any refugees. In Hungary, the first of the illiberal states, this all happened years before there were any refugees. So the refugee crisis is a part of it, but it can't be the complete explanation for it. There are many people, especially I think on the left, who think the explanation is fundamentally economic. It really has to do with the economic crisis of 2008 and the slow growth world we live in since then, and therefore the zero-sum mentality, that kind of dog-eat-dog mentality that sets in. David Leonhardt, who's a New York Times columnist, has written about this very, I think very wisely, and has said, in a no-growth world, it's very, very hard to direct people to values outside of themselves. That in such a world, people are all too willing to look for villains to explain the bad condition of their life. And the answer, therefore, the ultimate solution is going to have to be to re-stimulate economic growth, and we're going to live in that world till then. I'm not convinced of that. I mean, it's an appealing idea. I'm not convinced of that. First of all, because populist parties have shown some of their greatest strength in countries that are relatively prosperous and have not suffered. Sweden is, alas, an example. Poland was by far the economic engine of Eastern Europe. Holland is ranked high in absolutely everything. So I don't know that socioeconomics can explain it. And if it can't explain it, then what? I think the answer has to be it's culture. Culture is the word that we don't like to use. We tend to think that culture is this reactionary thing, and it's a kind of a mask or a drug or an opiate, because the truth is people's underlying economic reality. And people are badly off, so they cling to culture. There was a famous book written about a decade ago called What's the Matter with Kansas by an economist named Tom Frank. And Tom Frank said, why are all these working class and middle class people in Kansas voting for Republicans whose economic policies are so bad for them? Well, it's because they've been gulled, they've been fooled into thinking that these cultural issues like religion and abortion and so forth are really important. That was a kind of, pardon me, that was a successful ploy by the Republicans. Barack Obama famously said the same thing during the 2008 campaign. You may remember this comment. He said, they get bitter, they cling to guns or religion or antipathy to people who aren't like them, or anti-immigrant sentiment or anti-trade sentiment as a way to explain their frustrations. That's the argument that this culture stuff is irrelevant. It's really about people's economic condition. And I think that's clearly a lot of that's true, but it's almost certainly inadequate, and it's profoundly condescending to people who think, no, actually that culture, those issues of value matter a great deal to me. I think more than that, the unwillingness of people on the liberal side to be able to speak this language of culture has turned the word culture into a kind of talisman for people on the right, for the anti-immigrant, anti-refugee, nationalistic crowd. Best proof of this is Stephen Bannon. You know, we want to say Stephen Bannon, he's just a racist. He's the spokesman for angry white people. Yes, that's true. But Stephen Bannon sees America in the Jacksonian sense as having a national culture. And of course that culture is the culture of white Americans. But it's culture. And so he recently said at an event of the Conservative Political Action Committee, he said, the United States is not just a kind of economic unit in a globalized world. It's a nation with a culture and a reason for being. That's pretty much what Polish people said to me when I was in some small town in eastern Poland, and I said, why are you voting for this nationalistic party, the Law and Justice Party. That's the super nativist party that is now in power in Poland. And I remember I asked the mayor of this little town, and he said, why? He said, because I'm a Polish patriot. Because my family has been in this town for 500 years. Because I believe in family and church. To him, it was that self-evident. To him, the other party, they were the cosmopolitans, they were the universalists, they were the EU party, but they weren't the party of Polish culture. Now, if you ask people, what do you mean, culture? What is this culture that you're defending? People often don't know. I mean, what was the culture that English voters who voted for Brexit were defending? Was it tea and crumpets? I mean, it's, you don't know. You don't know, but what you know is that the language and the idea have become more and more powerful as people have felt more and more assailed by these others. I mean, the Dutch all say we want to preserve Dutch identity. Well, what the Dutch? You can't find anybody in Holland who will tell you what Dutch identity is. But they know it's not the abstract values that are enshrined in international law and EU treaties and all the things that liberal progressive Dutch would say Dutch identity is. I had an interesting conversation with a woman who is a Dutch convert to Islam. And she said to me, Islam has become the Dutch anti-identity. We don't know what our identity is, we know what our identity isn't. We're not Islamic. That's an interesting point, and that may be true almost everywhere. So, it still doesn't completely, so let's say the answer in some way, we have to accept the answer is that there's this profound cultural break in the world we live in. I still try to understand why that's happening now. Why has liberalism, these fundamental liberal values, come to be so profoundly suspect in the place that is the very citadel, the heart of liberalism? This is what my next book is about. So the answer is, I don't know the answer. I'm going to be thinking about it for a long time. And clearly, some part of the answer is what we all say, globalization. That means so many things, of course. It means people are disoriented by the incredibly rapid movement of goods and capital and people and all these new people who are in old places that people are resentful about. It means an accelerated pace of change. It also means the sense that there are these two classes. The globalization class of people who skate across the surface of Europe, all of us probably, and then people who don't, who feel like the left behind people. But there may be something deeper, a kind of bill that's coming due. And this is something, I think about it, I don't know if it's right. It's a little bit not in my nature. But I think that bill coming due is the secularism, the individualism, the materialism. And I mean that both in the literal sense of materialism and in the more metaphysical sense of not having a larger spiritual world. That is central to liberalism, to modern liberalism. That's not an issue for, I think, a lot of people in this room and in this arrondissement, because we're able to create our own life, to carve our own path, to find our own individual forms of fulfillment. But it leaves a lot of other people who don't live in this globalized world where you skate here and there to different places, feeling very empty. Konstanty Gebert, who is a brilliant Jewish, Polish journalist and thinker, explained to me why it was that the actually quite successful, very technocratic political party that had been running Poland for all these years and thought we'll win the election in 2015 because, as they used to say, we've kept hot water running in the taps. That was kind of their slogan. Why they were wrong. He said people wanted history. They wanted glory. They wanted meaning. And then he said, kind of half-jokingly, they wanted to make Poland great again. But they wanted meaning. It's interesting. So that it wasn't that Poland was failing. It wasn't that that party was failing. They weren't failing. But they were failing to bring something. So it is possible that at some time in the future we will see that, we will conclude that secularism was the God that failed. In The Paradox of Liberation, which is an interesting short book by the political philosopher Michael Walzer, Walzer asks, why is it that the dream that I and all my colleagues had in the late 1950s of a secular social democratic world that we saw then as sweeping across the third world failed? And not only failed, but in many cases led to a reactionary, nationalistic, religious regime. He uses odd examples. He uses the example of India under Modi. He used the example of Israel under Netanyahu. He said, why did this fail? Why were we wrong? And he concludes that the thing that they were offering was thin. It was thin. The people, in fact, needed history and meaning and glory. And even the prospect of a prosperous future, when achieved, wasn't enough for people. So I don't know quite what this will mean, but I think there is a kind of emptiness which is connected to the reaction, the anger, the back-lookingness that we feel in all of these places where populism has reared its head. Okay, so I've gone, oh my God, I've gone over. Okay, so I've gone far away from my original subject that you all came to hear about, the refugee crisis, so I just want to end very quickly by saying something about that again. Which is this. The refugee crisis posed an unbelievable political test to political leaders because it basically made them say to their people, we must do this thing because it is morally right, even though it's bad for us. Now, nobody said it's bad for us, but people felt that. And that's why most political leaders tried to punt. They wouldn't take refugees. But we have before us the example of Angela Merkel, who didn't do that, and who said, we must do this. This is the right thing to do, therefore we must do it. And it is quite true that since then, she in many ways has compromised. They've narrowed the list of people who were getting asylum. They've speeded up deportations. They've done all that stuff. She's never repented doing it. She's never said, I was wrong. She suffered, as I said before, a lot of political strife because of that, the rise of these right-wing parties. But none of it has proved to be fatal. And as we come into an election in Germany in September, her only real opponent is to the left, Martin Schulz, who was the head of the EU Parliament. So she did the right thing, she didn't back down, and she lived to tell the tale. So I just want to end on the note that things are bad, but unless you happen to live in the United States, they're not hopeless. Well, thank you.
What do you think about Merkel and I think it was Blair's official government positions that multiculturalism in their countries has failed?
Yeah, well, certainly
As
Merkel.
opposed to diversity.
Right. So, I mean, my quick answer to that would be multiculturalism is a word for one kind of way of dealing with the relationship between the us and the other. And it is one national strategy. In Canada, for example, which is really committed to the idea you should be able to hold on to your traditions, your history, your language, your culture, even as you integrate into our country, it seems to have worked. I don't know that it means it didn't work in Germany. What I do know is that Merkel is trying to find some language to speak that will counteract the effect of her generosity with the refugees. Certainly, I can tell you in Holland, multiculturalism is kind of a dead letter. And because of the sense that integration has failed, because multiculturalism was very much the official ideology of the 1990s, there was a moment when there was a kind of moment of recognition and people have said, this did not work. Our immigrants are not integrating. We have to say, you must speak Dutch. I mean, I went to a school where there were big signs up on the classroom doors. We only speak Dutch in the school. That may not be the multicultural way, but that's the way the Dutch are trying to do it. Yes, ma'am.
Don't you think the older immigrants who are coming from Aleppo, the family you talked about, who can't become German and so on, don't you think they just want in 10 years, 15 years, just go back to their country?
Difference between immigrants and refugees, of course, right?
Because for the moment they are refugees, they don't have
No,
the
but
choice.
here's what I mean. Refugees, the normal dynamic is that refugees who flee to the neighboring country wait there until they can return. Afghans who went to Pakistan, Sierra Leoneans who went to Guinea, whatever. Refugees who wind up 5,000 miles away rarely return. And so for all the criticism of the deal that the EU made with Turkey to keep the refugees there, part of the logic of that was that once they go beyond Turkey into Europe, they're not returning. And you would like to say that it is better for them, and many Europeans would say it is better for us, to cause them to be in a place from which they can return to their home, which otherwise they may not do. Yes, sir, in the back there. Yeah.
Me? Okay.
Yeah.
I think you're starting off with the idea that the people who you disagree with are basically, they're just sort of dividing the world into two parts. They would be, back in America, they'd be known as the deplorables. But do they have a point? Aren't there people who are not refugees crossing borders now? Are there not hundreds of millions of people who would like to enter Europe and America? And does Europe have any way of determining who will enter?
Well,
do you have anything other than to brand your people?
If I gave the impression,
word.
let me
Go ahead.
try to answer you. If I gave the impression that that's what I think, then I'm sorry, because I thought the impression I was trying to give was that we need to understand why people feel the way they do, and it is all very easy to be condescending in the way that you're describing if you are not on the receiving end, but for people who are, it's their real life. So, no, I actually don't think that it makes you a deplorable to feel this way, and I think that there is all the difference in the world between the fringe people, the real outright racists and skinheads and xenophobes whom I described, and many other people who have extremely legitimate fears and who have good reason to think that the million refugees who have come now are not getting integrated successfully as others. I mean, to take one example, Sweden is a country where virtually every non-Swede has come as a refugee because they don't really have they haven't for a long time had an active immigration policy. Of those refugees, the Bosnians, the Kurds, the Iranians, many others, everybody says, I love them, my pediatrician is a Bosnian, etc. Eritreans and Ethiopians have had much, much harder time. Syrians who have an 8th or 9th grade education, Afghans who have a 5th or 6th grade education are going to have yet a harder time. So those are legitimate concerns. So questions? Yes, sir.
I don't think you mentioned the word race. To what extent is racial prejudice a factor, not only in Europe but in the United States, and not just with respect to immigrants, but with respect to our African American population as well?
Well, okay, so you're asking about some things that are kind of within the scope of what I was talking about and some things that aren't. So let me just try, without going into a vast disquisition, I think that someone uses this word other and otherness and people's fear of the not like me. And it seems to me that there's a kind of hierarchy of otherness. And so Islam, so not race, but religion, becomes this extremely other thing. But if you're a Bosnian Muslim, for example, I heard this a lot in Holland, they're great, we like them. So European Islam kind of isn't quite Islam, it's almost Christianity. Whereas North African, that's bad. So in the case of the refugees, what I would say is the race issue comes in much more with West Africans and Sub-Saharan Africans. Now I didn't even talk about this because most of those people are not classical refugees. They're going to be viewed as immigrants because they're escaping poverty as opposed to warfare. But they are going to be, if anything, even a bigger political issue, I think, because for reasons of race and the fears that go with it, and the sense that they're not going to integrate, for all those reasons. And that one hasn't even fully kind of come into our political calculations yet, but will, because as the number of refugees diminishes because of the Turkey deal, the number of Africans coming in, for example, through Libya, which is ungovernable, that's going to continue. That's not going to stop. So that's a whole other dimension to be depressed about. Yes, in the back.
What advice do you have for a lot of us? Most of us are probably on the left side. For us who want to bridge this gap, or maybe find a good way to bring dialogue into what's kind of fell into our lap that we've inherited.
Well, I think, to sort of refer back to this gentleman's question, it actually is really important to understand that if you are living a relatively privileged life where diversity and multiculturalism are almost like cultural tastes, we so love living this way, it's important to recognize that's not how most people live. And so even though we might wish that they would feel otherwise, that people in Arizona would feel otherwise about the fraction of people on the street speaking Spanish, it's not just a kind of detestable provincialism. These are people's deep values. So I would just say in general that there's an active understanding, which is not the same thing at all as deference or surrender, but there has to be an active understanding that at least makes the conversation possible.
And tolerance.
Yes, so of course tolerance is a word that implies a kind of moral superiority. One tolerates one's inferiors. But yes, tolerance in a good sense. Yeah. Yes, sir.
How do you balance the resistance of white populations in general to immigrants and refugees from other climes, shall we say, with the reluctance of these immigrants and refugees to integrate themselves?
Yeah, well, this is the big question. And so, what's the reluctance? I mean, this is so. Let's say there's some parts of this where you can say, that's why, thank God Germany has enough money to give people language training and job training and all this stuff. The fear is that this reluctance is a kind of self-imposed self-isolation. And so I think one of the ways that the rubber's going to hit the road is when, for example, more and more people gain citizenship and vote, people will vote their own beliefs. And if you come from a pious, conservative background, and you think homosexuality is bad, and you think women don't have the same rights as men, that's going to be a real problem. I mean, to me, for example, the debate in this country last summer over the burkini was fascinating to me, because it was supposed to be France's defense of these Enlightenment ideals that women shouldn't be veiled, and yet it appeared, at least to me and to many people, to be a form of moral authoritarianism. And so how is Europe going to adapt to people in its midst who do not necessarily repudiate its values, but also don't entirely share them? And so does there need to be a degree of tolerance for people who believe, for example, that women should wear a headscarf or shouldn't wear a bikini on the beach? And so integration in that sense goes both ways. That it's going to be very hard to say to people, Europe, you must also accept that these people have beliefs of their own and aren't going to totally surrender them. Just as you need to be able to say to newcomers, you have come to this world and you have to embrace it. So that's a really complicated, hard thing. I think so we have time for a couple more questions, maybe. Yes, sir.
Yes, what do you think is the difference between the Asian refugees who came here you think the 13th arrondissement here in Paris, it's full of integrated people, but they live together.
Yeah.
How does it,
Most immigrants are. I mean, immigrants, first of all, there's a very important difference between the word immigrant and the word refugee. An immigrant is somebody who not only does the country say we want you, but you say I've come here because I want to work, I want to have a life here. The overwhelming fraction of immigrants in the world want nothing except to integrate, whatever integration means to them. So it's not anomalous, it is the norm. I mean, immigration is a good thing. And I'm an American, immigration is what we are. And the problem comes when either people don't have the ability or the willingness to integrate in the way that is normal, or with refugees, we're no longer dealing with that kind of straightforward transaction. Refugees haven't chosen to come, they've been propelled, and often they don't have the skills, they don't have the life experience, they have incredible scars that make it hard for them to become part of the world that they've moved into. Yes?
I wonder whether in your vision you think there is a limit to the expansion of populism and nationalism, this fear of the other, which is, say, you represent this as a cultural backlash, explained partly by economic events, but also by cultural feelings.
Right.
Don't you think there might be a limit that essentially this expansion of populism and nationalism at a certain point may reach and may stop, or do you think it's something that will be continuously in expansion in Western society?
Well, populism as a phenomenon is what, let's say, 150 or 175 years old in some meaningful way. And there have been spasms of it. And, the United States had a very powerful populist movement between the very late 1880s, but really only lasted for about a decade or so, and then it kind of burned itself out. Obviously, Europe had powerful right-wing populist movements in the 1930s. So no, I think that it's not as if this will become the new baseline, default, steady state of affairs. But I do think that if and when it burns itself out, it will still leave Europe in a very, very different place than the one that it was in before. So I think I should stop there. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.